All right, Texas Revolution Part 2. So we've seen how the tensions between the Mexican governments and the Texans, the settlers in Texas, Mexican Texas, had started leading to some uh, some trouble between the two, and we had seen how the Texans had time after time proclaimed their loyalty to Mexico and asked to become a Mexican state, and we had also learned how trouble at Anahuac and Velasco had raised tensions. And then, of course, Santa Anna takes over in Mexico, supposedly as a federalist, but then very much as a centralist, someone who wants to, of course, almost be a dictator. And many Texans then say, we have to do something. We can't let this sort of a dictator take over our colony that we work so hard to produce. And of course, during this time, Texans held meeting after meeting after meeting to try to decide what to do. And of course, by 1836, Texans were sort of holding their final meeting, the Convention of 1836. Meanwhile, Texan forces had basically driven the Mexican army out of Texas. But in December of 1835, Santa Anna arrives back in Texas with a huge army and of several thousand men. And he basically splits this army up, part of it going along the Gulf Coast, part of it taking a direct route to San Antonio. And in February, Santa Anna arrived at San Antonio, and the Texans that were there barricaded themselves inside the mission, the Alamo. Meanwhile, the Convention of 1836, which had been meeting at Washington on the Brazos, which is just up from San Felipe on the river, was writing a Declaration of Independence under Childress, and that declaration listed a lot of grievances, a lot of anger they had towards Santa Anna, but proclaimed that Texas was independent, and Texas delegates approved that document on March 2nd, 1836. They chose a sort of a temporary government until Santa Anna was dealt with, because of course they couldn't hold elections with an invasion underway. And they chose David G. Burnett as president, and Hispanic Lorenzo de Zavala as vice president. And of course, Sam Houston was made commander of both the regular army, which was then organizing, and also the various Texas militias in the various Texas towns. Meanwhile, of course, as we've seen, Santa Anna had surrounded the mission, the Alamo, and the about 200 troops in the Alamo were trying to hold off Santa Anna, hoping for reinforcements, but willing to fight to the death if reinforcements did not arrive. So eventually, of course, as we saw, Santa Anna raised the red flag, which means he would not take prisoners, that everybody be killed. Travis at one point offered to let anybody in the Alamo to basically sort of go over the walls and try to slip away to freedom, but only one person decided to take advantage of that. Everybody else stayed, knowing that they would probably die. The final battle, the siege, and the battle lasted about 13 days, which is sometimes why it's called 13 Days to Glory. But the final battle started March 6th at 5 a.m. With the Texans usually outnumbered. Within 90 minutes or so, the battle was all over. Santa Anna and the Mexican army won, but the battle cost Mexico many professional soldiers, and probably about 600 of Santa Anna's 2,000 men, Santa Anna's 2,000 men that he had with him at San Antonio, about 600 of them were either killed or wounded during that battle, and would be for sort of no further use to him in the campaign to sort of reconquer Texas. However, the Alamo did produce a wonderful slogan, "Remember the Alamo." So as Texans would think about what to do, as Santa Anna and the Mexican army continued to invade into Texas, many Texans were were angered. The people of the Alamo, the soldiers of the Alamo, not only had fought very bravely, but had been put to death and had been killed by Santa Anna. And remember, the Alamo slogan would sort of show their frustration and anger at Santa Anna and his government. So meanwhile, Sam Houston was basically ordering a retreat of Texas forces towards the Louisiana border, not to run away, but to give him time to train his troops and gather an army so he would have an army to fight back with. Of course, the second largest force, probably fighting force in Texas, was at Goliad under the command of James Fannin, probably about 450 troops. And they had also been ordered to retreat. At first, Fannin decided to go to help the Alamo, but he didn't get very far out of town when the supply wagons broke down, and he decided to go back in Goliad and wait for further developments. Eventually, when he was ordered to leave Goliad, he was a little bit slow in loading supplies and getting ready to leave. So his troops leave very slowly, and that gives the southern Mexican army that's proceeding along the Gulf Coast time to basically get near Goliad. So Fannin and his men will be leaving Goliad, and they'll be out in the open trying to retreat to the east. And meanwhile, this Mexican army, probably at first about 400 or 500 men, about the same as Fannin, arrive, and Fannin troops are basically surrounded at Coletta Creek. And within a day or so, however, the Mexican army there receives another additional 500 men, bringing their total to about 1,000. So even though on the first day of the Battle of Coletta Creek, Fannin and his men fought very bravely, they didn't have a large supply of gunpowder, they did not have a large supply of ammunition, and now they were outnumbered. So outnumbered 3-1, Fannin basically, asked for terms. Says, before we'll surrender, what are the terms of our surrender? You're not going to kill us too, like you do the Alamo. And the Mexican general says, no. What we're thinking is that we'll basically take you back to Goliad, and then we'll release you back to the United States. So Fannin and his men surrender, thinking that he'll be treated fairly, and basically that he'll be released and his men will be released to at least leave Texas. But Santa Anna had other plans. So an order arrives to basically kill the Texans that are now under guard at Goliad at the Presidio La Bahia. The commanding general basically writes another letter back saying, please don't do this. I've basically given my word to these people, and they were basically soldiers in battle, and they've been captured, and it's not very honorable to do this. But Santa Anna writes back that the executions are to be carried out. So the Texans are marched out in groups. Of course, initially they're told that they're being marched out to be set free, but as they march out of town, they're shot and killed. All 400 plus of them in what's called the Goliad Massacre. So now it's not only remember the Alamo, but it's also remember Goliad. Meanwhile, Houston's army. So when Houston arrived at Gonzales, remember Gonzales was the Lexington of Texas. It was where in 1835 the first shots of the Texas War for Independence were fired. So when he arrived at Gonzales, he brought the men that he had with him. He was expecting to find more volunteers for the army there. After 2 days at Gonzales, he learned that the Alamo had fallen to Santa Anna, and that Santa Anna was now moving in his direction. So as the Mexican army advanced towards Houston, he ordered his men to retreat. Again, basically to give the men more time to train, to try to get more men together. His plan was not to just run out of Texas. His plan was eventually to turn and fight somewhere. Houston kept retreating with his army as Santa Anna followed. And as Houston is retreating, of course, he's expecting that Fannin and the men at the men at Goliad, Fannin and the men at Goliad, are going to join him to make his army even larger. But then on March 25th, Houston finds out about the massacre at Goliad, that all 400 or 450 men have been killed. And obviously, they won't be joining his army or anybody else's army. And so Houston continues to move his army further east as Santa Anna follows. Of course, meanwhile, the news of the fall of the Alamo, the news of the massacre at Goliad, go across Texas by carrier, by horseback, by word of mouth, and many Texans are now very afraid that Santa Anna will basically kill everybody. That even though that many, the women and the children, they're left home at the homestead or on the farm, that Santa Anna might even kill those people as well. So Houston is continuing his retreat. The people learn about the Alamo disaster and Goliad, and again, the constant fear the Mexican army is going to harm them. People says, we have to get out of here. I mean, if Houston and his army aren't staying to fight, why should we stay around? And so a lot of civilians start to move east. Many of them hoping to get out of Texas, hoping to cross that the border at the Sabine River to get to Louisiana, to get to the United States. So we have hundreds of families gathering the belongings, and basically, some of them with wagons, some of them with their shirt on their back, moving towards the Sabine River, looking for some safety. So, a quick little video here, I hope. Okay, well, guess you'll have to watch that video separately, which is about the runaway scrape. Sorry that did not appear as it should have. So Houston and his men are continuing their retreat. And eventually, on April 20th, Texas troops camp on the banks of the Buffalo Bayou, which of course is near here, with their banks to the San Jacinto River. Santa Anna has marched through Harrisburg and other places that we now know as sort of Houston, and is basically waiting for General Koss, who's taking sort of the coastal route. He's waiting for reinforcements from General Koss before Santa Anna basically finishes off Sam Houston's army. So Santa Anna basically arrives during the night very close to where Sam Houston is, near the banks of the San Jacinto River. The next day, Santa Anna lets Koss and his men rest. So Santa Anna is now reinforced. Altogether, he has about 1,400 men with him. And it's during this time that because General Koss had basically marched in the middle of the night, his troops had marched all the previous day, and they're very tired. And so as morning breaks, Santa Anna allows his troops to sleep. He allows General Koss's men to stay in the tents they have erected because he realizes that his men are very tired, and that they're in really no shape to fight, that they need to sort of get their energy back. And of course, it's at this time that Houston basically turns and attacks. So Houston army attacks the Mexican army, and the battle only lasts about 18 minutes. That's because the Texan army at the battlefield of San Jacinto, there's a little rise, almost a little hill between Sam Houston's army and the army of Santa Anna. Sam Houston's army basically marches right up to the little rise, the little hill, which means they're very close to Santa Anna's camp. Unfortunately for the Mexican army, Santa Anna never posted sentries out that far, and so as the Texans troops start to charge from that hill towards the Mexican camp. It's only then that Mexican sentries see the Texans coming and shout the alarm. But of course, many Mexican soldiers are still sleeping. They're still in their tents. They're not prepared for battle. And so by the time the Mexicans are waking up, by the time they're getting their weapons or whatever, the Texans are actually at their tent. They're shooting into the tents. Of course, many Texans had their bayonets, their long knives on their rifles, and they're stabbing these sleeping Mexican army troops as they find them in their tents. And so many of the Mexican troopers basically just run away. They start to run away, and that's why the battle only lasted about 18 minutes. So this is a great victory for Texas. And unfortunately for the Mexican troopers, when they ran, the only direction for them really to run was towards the direction of some swamps, which many of them are really hard to run through sort of waist-deep water, especially with the enemy following you and shooting you. So those troops that did not drown, many of them were shot and killed there, and many of them just sort of started to surrender. So altogether at the time, the Mexican army had encamped about 1,400 troops, and Houston had about 900 troops under his command, but the attack was so quick and so ferocious. By the end of the battle, about 650 of the Mexican troopers were killed, about 208 of them were wounded, and 300 of them were captured. Santa Anna himself, of course, there's a wonderful story, whether it's true or not, but it said that Santa Anna was indisposed that morning, that he had woken up and had a young lady in his tent, a mulatto, the Yellow Rose of Texas, as sometimes she's called, and she was entertaining Santa Anna. So in the morning, as the Texans got ready and prepared, one reason Santa Anna was not out inspecting and making sure his sentries were on duty and things like that was that he was occupied in his tent with this young lady. And so sometimes credit is given to her skills in distracting Santa Anna long enough for the Texan forces to attack very quickly and efficiently the Mexican army. But nevertheless, eventually Santa Anna was also found. He had, as he ran out and saw the disaster which was unfolding, he apparently had just put on sort of found a coat from a regular soldier and put that on. So he was not in his sort of dress uniform that Texans were well familiar with from the Alamo, but he just sort of looked like a regular soldier. So when he was captured, he was basically just brought to where all the other regular Mexican soldiers were being held prisoner, but they immediately recognized who Santa Anna was, and of course they started to bow and chant, "Your Excellency," all hail Santa Anna. At which point, of course, the Texas troops immediately recognized they had captured Santa Anna, the general and the president of Mexico. And with Santa Anna captured, this will basically end the Texas Revolution, in which Texas wins. So Santa Anna, famous painting that he's brought to Sam Houston, who's under a tree, recovering from a wound he suffered in the battle. And naturally, many of the Texans were very angry at Santa Anna and wished to see him dead for what he had done at the Alamo and what he had ordered at Goliad. But Sam Houston recognized that Santa Anna was better off alive than dead, at least for the prospects of an independent Texas. So Santa Anna was kept alive by order of Sam Houston, so he could work out a peace deal that would create the Republic of Texas. The eventual treaty was worked out at Velasco, which is why it's called the Treaty of Velasco. Under this treaty, it ends the Texas Revolutionary War. So basically, they worked out an agreement, but part of the agreement was going to be kept private or secret. The other part of the agreement was immediately released to the public. So in the public treaty, Santa Anna agreed that he would not fight against Texas again. Of course, in exchange, he would, not be killed. Also, because he was still president of Mexico and still general, he would order all Mexican forces out of Texas because there were other Mexican armies in Texas at the time. And there would be a prisoner exchange, that the Mexican troopers that had been captured at San Jacinto would be sent back to Mexico. Meanwhile, other Texans that had been captured in battle that had not been killed, they would be set free. And that the Mexican army would return all property that they had taken during the war. And that property, of course, might include slaves. Meanwhile, in the private treaty, which again basically had the same stuff as the public treaty, except there was some extra stuff. And of course, the extra stuff, it basically says Santa Anna's going to live and that he's going to be free to return to Mexico. Although, as we'll see, Mexico really didn't want him back at the time. So eventually, Santa Anna would be sent to the United States for a time before he returned to Mexico. But nevertheless, in the private treaty, Santa Anna agreed to work to help to get Texas recognized as an independent country. So Santa Anna would basically say that Texas is independent, but just because Mexico recognized Texas independence, at least that's what Texans hoped they would do, that did not mean other nations would recognize Texas independence. So Texas certainly wanted the United States to recognize their independence. And other of the world's what they call the great powers, the countries that had a lot of wealth and big armies at the time, such as France and Great Britain, Texas wanted their recognition as well. So Santa Anna agreed to basically sort of be an agent for Texas, a publicity agent for Texas, and hopefully with his backing, these other countries would grant Texas status as its own nation. So by defeating General Santa Anna, Texas becomes a new country. Yes, Texas was declared a new country in March of 1836, but simply declaring something does not mean it actually is reality, does not actually mean it comes about. You can declare right now that you are graduated from high school, but that does not mean you're graduated from high school. Sorry, that's not the reality. So even though Texans said they were independent, they actually had to fight for their independence. And that fight was successful. So Texas becomes the Republic of Texas, sometimes called the Lone Star Republic after its one star in its flag. Sam Houston will eventually become the first president of the Republic of Texas. Many Texans were very grateful that Houston had commanded the army and had not risked an open attack against the Mexicans on open field, but instead waited until the exact right time to attack the Mexican army and win our independence. Another of their leaders, Mary Lamar, would become the first vice president of Texas, and the Battle of San Jacinto would become a very decisive battle in history, even though it was very short, 18 minutes, because it would, of course, secure the independence of Texas and eventually lead to the great state that Texas is now.